In March of 1945, on the island of Okinawa, beneath a grey sky heavy with the promise of rain, Lieutenant Keiko Yamamoto stood at attention in what remained of the Imperial Japanese Army nursing station. She had been taught that Americans were demons, monsters who would show no mercy. She had been told that capture meant unspeakable horrors, that death was preferable to surrender. In 23 days, everything she believed would be proven catastrophically wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how 147 Japanese military nurses encountered something their training had never prepared them for, something that would shatter their understanding of the world and reveal a truth more powerful than any propaganda. The simple, transformative act of being treated as human beings. Keiko had joined the military nursing corps in 1942, straight out of the Tokyo Women's Medical College. She was 20 years old then, idealistic, believing deeply in the cause she had been taught to serve. Her father, a retired Imperial Army officer, had been proud when she volunteered. Her mother had wept, but said nothing. In those days, young women across Japan were answering the call, eager to prove their dedication, their worthiness in service to the empire. The nursing station on Okinawa had been established in February, carved into the limestone caves that honeycombed the southern part of the island. 147 nurses worked there, tending to wounded soldiers who arrived in waves after each engagement with American forces. The conditions were primitive. They worked by lamplight with dwindling medical supplies, often performing procedures that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Keiko had assisted in amputations without anesthesia, had held dying soldiers as they called for their mothers, had learned to keep her face composed even as the stench of gangrene and death filled the underground chambers. Among the nurses was Nurse Hiroko Tanaka, a 31-year-old woman from Osaka who had worked at a civilian hospital before the conflict. She was practical, efficient, and served as something of a mother figure to the younger nurses. There was also Nurse Yuki Sato, barely 19, who had arrived on Okinawa only 6 weeks earlier and still sometimes cried quietly at night when she thought no one could hear. And there was Nurse Michiko Ito, 25, from a farming family in Hokkaido, who possessed an unshakable calmness that the others found reassuring in the darkest moments. The education they had received was explicit and uncompromising. During their military training in Tokyo, they had attended lectures on enemy forces. The Americans, they were told, were barbaric. The instructors had shown them propaganda materials depicting American soldiers as brutal, uncontrolled. They were told repeatedly that capture would mean violation, torture, death. Better to take one's own life, the instructors emphasized, than to fall into enemy hands. Each nurse had been issued a small canister, hidden in their medical kits. The purpose was never explicitly stated, but everyone understood. Keiko remembered one particular lecture in December of 1944. The instructor, a severe woman in her 50s named Captain Nakamura, had stood before the assembled nurses and spoken in clipped, certain tones. The American forces include troops from various backgrounds, she had said. Some of these troops come from a people who are considered inferior, even in their own country. These individuals, Captain Nakamura had continued, are especially dangerous, especially uncontrolled. You must understand that they lack the civilization and discipline of proper soldiers. At the time, Keiko had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? Captain Nakamura was an educated woman, an officer, someone who had access to information that ordinary people did not. The other nurses had nodded solemnly, their faces pale but determined. They understood what was being asked of them. They understood what they might face. By late March of 1945, the situation on Okinawa had deteriorated dramatically. American forces had established positions across much of the island. The sounds of artillery were constant, a low thunder that shook dust from the cave ceilings and made the nurses flinch despite their efforts to appear calm. Supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. They were rationing bandages, reusing them after washing them in increasingly contaminated water. Medical alcohol was gone. Morphine was a distant memory. They did what they could with what they had, which was very little. On the morning of April 7th, a runner arrived at the nursing station with orders. The message was brief and devastating. The position was no longer tenable. They were to evacuate immediately, moving south to another cave system approximately 8 kilometers away. They had 2 hours to prepare. The evacuation was chaos. 147 nurses, each carrying what medical supplies they could manage, emerged from the caves into daylight that seemed blindingly bright after weeks underground. They moved in a column, trying to stay organized, trying to move quickly. Some of the nurses were carrying wounded soldiers who could not walk. Others hauled boxes of supplies, the precious little that remained. Keiko was near the middle of the column, helping Nurse Sato carry a stretcher with a soldier who had lost both legs. The young man was delirious with fever, mumbling words they couldn't understand. His name was Private Kobayashi, and he was 18 years old. They had been treating him for 5 days, knowing his chances were poor but trying anyway because that was what they did. They had been moving for approximately 40 minutes when they heard the sound. It came from the east, a deep rumbling that was distinct from artillery. Vehicles, many vehicles. The column stopped, nurses looking at each other with wide eyes. The senior officer present, Lieutenant Commander Hasegawa, raised her hand for silence. They listened. The sound was growing closer. What happened next occurred very quickly. From behind a ridge approximately 300 meters away, American vehicles appeared. Tanks, personnel carriers, troops on foot. The column of nurses was exposed, visible, trapped in open ground between the cave they had left and the destination they had not reached. Lieutenant Commander Hasegawa made a decision. There was nowhere to run that would not result in being caught. Fighting was impossible. They were nurses, unarmed except for their medical implements, exhausted, responsible for wounded who could not move. She ordered the white flags raised. Bed sheets, bandages, anything that could signal surrender. The decision took perhaps 10 seconds. For some of the nurses, it would take months or years to understand that this decision had saved their lives. Keiko watched as American soldiers approached. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her hands were shaking. Next to her, Nurse Sato had gone completely white, swaying slightly as if she might faint. Nurse Tanaka, the practical one from Osaka, had her jaw set tight. Her eyes fixed on the approaching Americans with an expression that might have been defiance or terror or both. The American soldiers were cautious at first, weapons raised but not pointed directly at the nurses. They were shouting in English, words that Keiko did not understand. The tone seemed more confused than aggressive, as if they had not expected to encounter a large group of nurses. One soldier, who appeared to be in command, was speaking into a radio handset, presumably calling for instructions. And then Keiko saw them. Among the American soldiers were men with dark skin. Not the tan of someone who had spent time in the sun, but deep brown, darker than anyone she had ever seen. She had known intellectually that such people existed, but knowing and seeing were entirely different things. Captain Nakamura's words echoed in her mind, especially dangerous, especially uncontrolled. Several of these soldiers approached the front of the nurses' column. One of them, a tall man with sergeant stripes on his uniform, walked directly to Lieutenant Commander Hasegawa. He was carrying his weapon slung over his shoulder, not in his hands. His stance was alert but not threatening. When he spoke, his voice was deep and calm. Keiko could not understand his words, but she could understand his tone. It was professional. It was concerned. The sergeant was gesturing to the wounded soldiers, to the nurses' obvious exhaustion, asking questions. Lieutenant Commander Hasegawa, who knew some English from her years at university, was attempting to respond, her voice shaking but clear enough. More American soldiers arrived. A medic, identified by the red cross on his helmet and armband, moved quickly to examine Private Kobayashi, the young man Keiko and Nurse Sato had been carrying. The medic was one of the dark-skinned soldiers, a corporal whose hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked Kobayashi's vital signs, examined his wounds. His face was serious, focused, professional. He said something to another soldier who ran back to one of the vehicles and returned with medical supplies. Real medical supplies, antibiotics, clean bandages, morphine. The corporal administered an injection to Kobayashi, whose thrashing immediately began to quiet. He wrapped the young man's wounds with clean white bandages, working carefully, talking quietly to him even though Kobayashi could not understand English. The tone was soothing, the kind of voice one might use with a frightened child. Keiko watched this, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been taught. This was wrong. This was not what was supposed to happen. These soldiers, these dark-skinned men who were supposed to be the most dangerous, the most uncontrolled, were treating their enemy wounded with care and competence. It made no sense. The American soldiers organized the nurses and wounded into groups. They were not rough, did not shout or threaten. One young private, who appeared to be barely older than Nurse Sato, offered his canteen to an elderly nurse who was clearly dehydrated. She took it hesitantly, expecting some kind of trick, but he simply nodded encouragingly and moved on to offer water to others. They were loaded onto vehicles. The wounded were given priority, placed carefully on stretchers in the backs of trucks. The nurses climbed aboard other vehicles, packed tightly but not uncomfortably. Keiko found herself sitting across from a dark-skinned soldier who was probably in his mid-20s. He had kind eyes, she noticed, and when he saw her staring, he smiled slightly and nodded. It was not a threatening gesture. It was just acknowledgement, human to human. The convoy moved north toward American lines. The journey took approximately 2 hours. During that time, no one harmed them. No one threatened them. The soldiers largely ignored them, focused on their own tasks, occasionally offering water or sharing rations with nurses who looked particularly exhausted. They arrived at a large tent complex that had clearly been set up as a medical facility. The American flag flew overhead, and for a moment Keiko felt a rush of fear. This was it. This was where it would happen. Whatever horrors they had been warned about, they would occur here. Instead, they were taken to a processing area where American medical personnel, including female nurses in U.S. Army uniforms, began conducting health screenings. The American nurses were gentle, speaking in soft voices even though language was a barrier. They checked for injuries, for signs of disease, offered water, and basic medical attention. Keiko was examined by an American nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a woman probably in her early 30s from somewhere called Kansas. Mitchell's hands were cool and professional as she checked Keiko's vitals, examined her for wounds or illness. She spoke continuously in English, her tone reassuring even though Keiko understood only fragments. The Japanese nurses were given identification tags, assigned to a section of the camp designated for female prisoners. The area was surrounded by fencing and guards, but the guards were not aggressive. They stood at their posts looking bored more than threatening. Inside the fenced area were tents set up with cots, real cots with blankets. There were latrines that, while basic, were functional and more sanitary than what they had been using in the caves. There was a water supply, clean enough to drink without boiling. That first night, as darkness fell and the nurses gathered in the largest tent, there was confusion and disbelief. Nurse Tanaka, the practical one, was the first to speak what many were thinking. "This is not what we were told to expect," she said quietly. "They treated our wounded. They gave us water. They did not harm us." Some of the nurses refused to believe it would last. "This is the first day," one insisted. "They are trying to make us trust them. Then they will do what they always intended." Others were less certain. Nurse Sato, the youngest, asked the question that many were afraid to voice. What if we were lied to? What if everything we were told was wrong? Keiko lay on her cot that night, unable to sleep, replaying the day's events in her mind. The sergeant with the calm voice, the corporal who had treated Private Kobayashi with such care, the young private who had shared his water, the dark-skinned soldiers who were supposed to be monsters but who had acted like ordinary men doing their jobs. It was too much to process, too much to accept all at once. She had been prepared for death. She had been prepared for unspeakable things. She had not been prepared for kindness. The next morning, they were given breakfast. Real breakfast. Rice, which they had not seen in weeks. Bread, canned fruit, coffee. The portions were not large, but they were adequate. More food than they had eaten in a single meal in months. American soldiers served it from large containers, moving down lines of prisoners, scooping food onto metal trays. The dark-skinned soldiers worked alongside their lighter-skinned comrades, no distinction made between them in terms of duties or behavior. One of these soldiers, a corporal named James Washington from a place called Alabama, served Keiko her portion. He smiled at her, said something in English that included the word breakfast, and gestured for her to take extra bread. When she hesitated, confused by the offer, he simply placed an additional slice on her tray and moved on to the next person. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary gesture, but it struck Keiko with surprising force. This man, who she had been taught to fear above all others, had just given her extra food, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. After breakfast, the nurses were assembled in groups and told through interpreters that they would be assigned work details. This caused immediate tension. Work details could mean anything, but what they were asked to do was continue their profession. The American medical facility was overwhelmed with casualties, both American and Japanese. They needed additional medical personnel. The Japanese nurses, having demonstrated their training and capabilities, were being given the opportunity to continue working as nurses, treating wounded from both sides under American supervision. Lieutenant Commander Hasegawa accepted on behalf of all of them. What else could she do? They were nurses. This was their purpose, their training. Better to work than to sit idle. And working would allow them to observe, to understand, to learn the truth of their situation. Keiko was assigned to a ward that treated surgical patients, both American and Japanese soldiers recovering from operations. Her supervisor was an American nurse named Captain Eleanor Rodriguez, a brisk, efficient woman from New York, who spoke no Japanese but made her expectations clear through demonstration and patience. Working alongside Keiko was Corporal Washington, the man who had given her extra bread. The first few days were awkward. Language was a constant barrier. Procedures differed in small but significant ways between Japanese and American medical practice. Keiko was nervous, afraid of making mistakes, afraid that any error would result in punishment. But Captain Rodriguez was patient, showing rather than telling, correcting gently when Keiko misunderstood something. And Corporal Washington, despite his limited medical training, was unfailingly helpful, carrying supplies, assisting with patient movement, translating when he could through an interpreter who made regular rounds. Keiko began to notice things, small things. The way American medical personnel treated their patients, regardless of whether those patients were American or Japanese. The way they used pain medication generously, unwilling to let anyone suffer unnecessarily. The way they kept meticulous records, tracked every patient's progress, adjusted treatment based on response. The way they worked as teams, with different roles but mutual respect, regardless of the skin color of the team members. Corporal Washington, she learned, had been a medical orderly in civilian life working at a hospital in Birmingham. He had joined the Army in 1942, trained as a medic, been assigned to a unit that had fought its way across the Pacific. He had seen terrible things, treated horrific wounds, lost friends and patients, yet he remained gentle with the wounded, patient with the frightened Japanese prisoners who flinched when he approached, kind in small ways that cost him nothing but meant everything. One afternoon, approximately 10 days after their capture, Keiko was changing bandages on a Japanese soldier who had been injured in the leg. The man was perhaps 40 years old, a veteran who had served since the conflict in China. He was watching Corporal Washington with undisguised fear, his whole body tense. When Washington approached to help lift the patient so Keiko could access the wound properly, the Japanese soldier actually cried out, trying to pull away despite the pain it caused. Washington stopped immediately. He backed away, hands raised in a gesture of peace. He spoke quietly to Captain Rodriguez, who nodded and came over to assist instead. Washington moved to the other side of the ward, giving the frightened soldier space. Later, through an interpreter, Keiko learned what Washington had said. "The patient is afraid. I will not force my presence on him. Let him see that he is safe first. Then perhaps he will trust." That evening, Keiko found herself in the mess tent at the same time as several American soldiers, including Corporal Washington and Sergeant Thomas Jefferson from Georgia. They were sitting at a table with other soldiers of various backgrounds, eating dinner, talking quietly. Through an interpreter who happened to be present, Keiko worked up the courage to ask a question that had been bothering her. "Why are you kind to us?" she asked. "We are your enemies. We would have done everything possible to defeat you. Why do you treat us with such care?" The soldiers looked at each other. Sergeant Jefferson, a man in his 30s with scars on his arms and a tired face, was the one who answered. "Because you are prisoners now," he said simply. "The conflict continues, but you are no longer fighting. You are wounded, or you are medical personnel caring for wounded. We have rules about how we treat such people. We follow those rules because we believe they are right. But also," Corporal Washington added quietly, "because you are human beings. That does not change because we were on different sides. That does not change because of the color of my skin or yours, or because we speak different languages. You are human beings who need care, so we provide it." Keiko did not know what to say to this. She had been taught that Americans, particularly dark-skinned Americans, lacked humanity, lacked civilization, lacked the capacity for such thoughts. Yet here was a man expressing philosophy, expressing moral reasoning, expressing exactly the kind of elevated thinking that she had been assured was beyond him. The confusion must have shown on her face, because Sergeant Jefferson smiled slightly, a sad smile. "You were told things about us," he said. "It was not a question. We know. We have seen it in how the prisoners react when they first arrive, especially to men who look like Washington here. You were told we are monsters, yes?" Keiko nodded slowly, ashamed but unable to deny it. "And now you see we are not," Jefferson continued. "Now you see we are soldiers doing a job, trying to survive, trying to do what is right when we can. This is confusing for you, I understand, but perhaps this confusion is the beginning of wisdom." Over the following days, Keiko watched and learned. She saw American soldiers of all backgrounds working together, eating together, treating each other as equals. She saw dark-skinned officers giving orders to lighter-skinned enlisted men, and those orders being followed without question. She saw medical teams where the surgeon might be white and the chief nurse might be black, or vice versa, and no one seemed to think this was unusual or wrong. She also saw tensions. Not everything was perfect. She overheard arguments, saw resentments, noticed that some soldiers seemed to prefer the company of those who looked like them. But these were the normal conflicts of any group of people working under stress. They were not the systematic brutality, the complete lack of civilization that she had been taught to expect. Nurse Tanaka, working in a different ward, had her own revelations. She was assigned to work with a dark-skinned surgeon named Captain Marcus Thompson from Chicago. Thompson was 35 years old, had been practicing medicine for 8 years before the conflict, and was one of the most skilled surgeons in the facility. Tanaka, who had assisted in countless surgeries during her time in Osaka and then on Okinawa, recognized excellence when she saw it. Thompson's hands were steady. His decisions were quick and correct. His knowledge of anatomy and procedure was beyond question. After a particularly difficult surgery, during which Thompson had managed to save the life of a Japanese soldier with a severe abdominal wound, Tanaka found herself speaking to him through an interpreter. "I was told that men like you were inferior," she said bluntly. "I was told you lacked education, lacked intelligence, lacked civilization, but I have worked with many surgeons, and you are among the best I have seen. I do not understand how both things can be true." Thompson looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, slowly, giving the interpreter time to translate. "Both things cannot be true," he said. "You were lied to. It is that simple and that complicated. In my country, there are those who tell similar lies about people who look like me. They say we are inferior, we are less intelligent, we are less capable. Yet here I am, a surgeon, educated at one of the finest medical schools in America, serving my country as an officer. The lies persist because they serve those who tell them, but they are still lies." He paused, then added, "What you must decide now is whether you will continue believing the lies you were told, or whether you will believe the evidence of your own eyes." This was the central dilemma that all the nurses faced as days turned into weeks. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The American soldiers, including and especially those they had been taught to fear most, were not monsters. They were men with families, with hopes, with fears, with honor and discipline and humanity. Some were kind, some were stern, some were funny, some were serious. But none were the demons of propaganda. Young Nurse Sato had perhaps the most dramatic transformation. Terrified at first, barely able to function, she had been assigned to work in the laundry facility, where it was thought she might feel less threatened. There she worked alongside American soldiers from a quartermaster unit, including a dark-skinned private named David Chen, whose family had come to America from the Caribbean. Chen was 22 years old, gentle-natured, spoke softly, and had a habit of humming while he worked. Over time, Sato's fear faded. Chen made no demands, no threats. He simply worked alongside her, occasionally helping her with heavy loads without being asked, sometimes sharing candy from his rations, always respectful of her space and her obvious nervousness. After 3 weeks, Sato actually smiled at him when he made a funny face after dropping a basket of uniforms. It was a small moment, barely worth noting, except that it represented a complete collapse of everything she had been taught to believe. The American camp had resources that seemed impossible to the Japanese nurses. Fresh food arrived regularly. Medical supplies were abundant to the point of wastefulness by Japanese standards. American soldiers routinely discarded bandages that could have been washed and reused, threw away medications that were slightly expired, replaced equipment that was worn but still functional. The sheer abundance was staggering. One evening, Keiko was walking back to the prisoners section when she passed a gathering of American soldiers. They were celebrating something, she learned through an interpreter who was passing by. The conflict in Europe had ended. Germany had surrendered. The soldiers were jubilant, sharing drinks, laughing, embracing each other. Dark-skinned and light-skinned soldiers celebrated together. No distinction, no separation. Just men who were happy that part of the conflict had ended, even though their own fight continued. Corporal Washington saw Keiko watching. He approached, his usual careful smile in place. "Big news," he said through the interpreter. "Germany has surrendered. The fight in Europe is over. Only Japan remains now." Keiko nodded, not sure what to say. The interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier named Kenneth Tanaka, who spoke both languages fluently, seemed to sense her confusion. He explained more fully, "For American soldiers, this means they hope the conflict will end soon. They are tired. They want to go home to their families. They do not hate you, Nurse Yamamoto. They just want this to be over." Washington nodded when this was translated back to him. "We hope your leaders will see reason," he said. "We hope they will surrender before more people have to suffer. We do not want to continue fighting, but we will do what we must." That night, lying in her cot, Keiko thought about surrender, about what it meant, about how she had been taught that surrender was shameful, was unthinkable, was the worst thing a soldier could do. Yet these American soldiers spoke of surrender as sensible, as reasonable, as the right choice when continuing to fight meant only more death. They did not seem to think less of the Japanese soldiers who had surrendered. They treated them the same as they treated everyone else in their care. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking about honor, about duty, about what mattered. Keiko had been raised in a culture that valued death over defeat, that saw surrender as absolute shame. The Americans seemed to value life over pride, seemed to believe that surviving to fight another day, or surviving to return to family, was more honorable than dying for a cause that might already be lost. As May turned into June, the atmosphere in the camp began to change. More prisoners arrived, including some military personnel who had been captured in different circumstances. Some of these new arrivals were shocked by what they saw: Japanese nurses working alongside American medical staff, Japanese prisoners being treated with basic respect, dark-skinned American soldiers behaving with professionalism and discipline. One newly arrived Japanese officer, a lieutenant from an infantry unit, loudly declared that the nurses had been corrupted, that they had allowed themselves to be deceived by enemy propaganda. He refused to accept treatment from any dark-skinned medical personnel, insisted on seeing only officers, demanded to be treated as his rank required. The Americans accommodated him where possible, but Captain Rodriguez made it clear through an interpreter that his prejudices did not dictate policy. "You will be treated by whoever is assigned to treat you," she said firmly. "If Corporal Washington is the medic on duty, then Corporal Washington will provide your care. You may accept this, or you may refuse treatment entirely. Those are your choices. The lieutenant chose to refuse treatment for a minor wound on his arm. 3 days later, when the wound became infected and fever set in, he had no choice but to accept care from the person available, who happened to be Corporal Washington. Washington treated him with the same professional care he showed everyone, cleaning and dressing the infected wound, administering antibiotics, checking on him regularly. He showed no anger at the lieutenant's earlier refusal, no resentment at his obvious prejudice. He simply did his job. Keiko watched this interaction with fascination. The lieutenant, delirious with fever at first, ranted about the corruption of the nurses, about how they had betrayed their teachings. But as the antibiotics took effect and his fever broke, he became quiet. He watched Washington work, watched the care and competence, watched the complete lack of the brutality he had been promised. By the time he was recovered enough to return to the general prisoner population, his certainty had been replaced with troubled silence. The transformation happening among the nurses was not uniform. Some, like Keiko and Nurse Tanaka, engaged directly with what they were experiencing, questioned their previous beliefs, actively worked to understand this new reality. Others, like Nurse Michiko Ito from Hokkaido, simply accepted what was happening with pragmatic calm, neither embracing nor rejecting, just adapting as necessary to survive. But some nurses struggled more deeply. One woman, Nurse Kazuko Watanabe, who had lost her entire family in an air attack on Tokyo, could not reconcile her grief and rage with the kindness she was being shown. She withdrew, barely speaking, performing her duties mechanically, but engaging with no one. The American medical staff, recognizing signs of severe distress, assigned her to work in the medical records section, where she would have less direct patient contact. They showed her the same care they showed everyone else, even though she gave them nothing in return but silent hostility. As June progressed, preparations began for something the Americans called the final push. More troops were arriving, more supplies were being accumulated. The entire island was becoming one massive staging area for what everyone knew would be the culmination of the Pacific conflict. The tension was palpable, even in the relatively protected space of the medical facility. The Japanese nurses understood what this meant. An invasion of Japan itself was coming. Their homeland would become a battlefield. Everything they had seen, all the destruction and suffering and death that had consumed Okinawa, would be visited upon Japan. The thought was almost unbearable. One evening in mid-June, a group of nurses gathered in their section, talking quietly. Nurse Tanaka, as usual, was the most direct. "If they invade Japan," she said, "it will be terrible. But if our leaders do not surrender, what choice do the Americans have? This conflict cannot continue forever. One side must admit defeat." "But at what cost?" another nurse asked. "How many must suffer before our leaders accept the inevitable?" Keiko had been thinking about this question constantly. She had seen American military power, had witnessed the casual abundance that suggested industrial capacity beyond anything Japan could match. She had also seen American values, the emphasis on preserving life when possible, the medical care that was given even to enemies. She spoke quietly, hesitantly, afraid of how her words might be received. "What if," she said, "what if the kindest thing our leaders could do for Japan would be to surrender now, before more cities are destroyed, before more soldiers and civilians suffer? I know this sounds like I have been corrupted by the enemy. I know this would have been unthinkable to me 3 months ago. But I have seen things that make me question everything I was taught. And the question I cannot escape is this: what are we fighting for at this point? What can we possibly hope to achieve except more death?" The silence that followed was profound. Some nurses looked scandalized, others looked thoughtful. Nurse Tanaka finally nodded slowly. "These are dangerous thoughts," she said. "Treasonous thoughts, some would say. But they are also thoughts that come from caring about what happens to our people. I do not know the answer. I do not know what is right. But I know that continuing as we have been leads only to more suffering." The conversation ended there, but the questions remained. These were women who had been raised to serve, to obey, to trust in their leaders' wisdom. Now they found themselves questioning everything, torn between loyalty to what they had been taught and what they were learning through direct experience. By late June, the Japanese nurses had been in American custody for nearly 3 months. In that time, not one had been harmed by the American soldiers they had been taught to fear. Not one had experienced the horrors they had been promised. Instead, they had been fed, clothed, given medical care, allowed to continue their profession, treated as human beings rather than enemies. The psychological impact was profound. Every day that passed without brutality was another small erosion of certainty, another piece of evidence that contradicted their education. The dark-skinned soldiers, who were supposed to be especially dangerous, had proven to be men like any others, no more and no less threatening than their lighter-skinned comrades. If that fundamental belief was wrong, then what else might be wrong? If the Americans were not demons, then perhaps Japan's cause was not as righteous as they had been told. If surrender did not mean immediate death or worse, then perhaps continuing to fight was not the only honorable choice. These were revolutionary thoughts, dangerous thoughts, thoughts that could not be spoken too loudly or too freely. But they were there, growing stronger with each passing day, with each small kindness, with each moment of ordinary human interaction, between people who were supposed to be mortal enemies, but who were increasingly just people working together, surviving together, finding common humanity despite language and culture and all the barriers that had been erected between them. Keiko lay in her cot on the night of June 28th, exactly 3 months since their capture, and realized something that would have horrified her younger self. She no longer wanted Japan to continue fighting. She wanted it to end, wanted it to stop, wanted no more suffering on either side. She wanted to go home, wanted to see her family again, wanted to rebuild whatever life might be possible in whatever Japan would exist after the conflict ended. And she wanted Corporal Washington to go home too. She wanted Sergeant Jefferson to return to Georgia. She wanted Captain Thompson to go back to Chicago and resume his medical practice. She wanted all of them to survive, to return to their families, to live the lives they had put on hold to fight this terrible conflict. This realization should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like awakening, like finally seeing clearly after years of looking through distorted glass. The propaganda had been wrong, not just slightly wrong, not just exaggerated, but fundamentally, completely, catastrophically wrong. And if that was true, then everything that flowed from that propaganda, all the sacrifices and suffering and death, had been based on lies. It was almost too much to bear. But it was also, in a strange way, liberating. Because if they had been lied to about this, if their enemies were not monsters but men, then surrender was not shameful. Survival was not cowardice. And perhaps, when this was all over, there could be something other than endless conflict. Perhaps there could be peace. These thoughts occupied Keiko's mind as she drifted towards sleep, unaware that in just over a month, history would take a turn that would make all these questions both more urgent and more terrible than anyone could imagine. July arrived with oppressive heat and humidity that made every task exhausting. The American medical facility continued its steady rhythm, treating casualties, processing new prisoners, preparing for what everyone knew was coming. Keiko had settled into a routine that 3 months earlier would have seemed impossible. She worked alongside Corporal Washington and Captain Rodriguez, treating patients from both sides, and found herself thinking less about nationality and more about individual human beings who needed care. On the morning of July 16th, something unusual happened. Additional security appeared around the camp. Officers moved with obvious tension, gathering in groups for hushed conversations. Something significant was happening, but the nurses did not know what. Through the interpreter, Kenneth Tanaka, they learned only that an important test had occurred somewhere far away, but no details were provided. The days that followed felt strange, as if the entire American military was holding its breath, waiting for something. More troops arrived. The medical staff began preparing for massive casualties, setting up additional surgical theaters, stockpiling supplies. The nurses worked longer hours, helping with preparations they did not fully understand. On August 6th, everything changed. Keiko was working in the surgical ward when she noticed unusual activity among the American medical staff. Doctors and nurses were gathering around a radio in the administrative area, listening intently to a broadcast. Captain Rodriguez's face was pale, her expression a mixture of horror and relief that seemed contradictory. Through Kenneth Tanaka, the news reached the Japanese nurses. A new type of weapon had been used on Hiroshima. A single device had destroyed most of the city. Casualties were estimated in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. The scale was almost incomprehensible. The Japanese nurses reacted with shock and grief. Hiroshima was gone, an entire city erased in an instant. Some nurses had family in that region. Nurse Watanabe, who had already lost her family in Tokyo, simply sat down on the floor and stared at nothing, her face empty of expression. Keiko felt numb. She tried to imagine an entire city destroyed by one weapon, but her mind could not grasp it. Captain Rodriguez approached her, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I am sorry," she said through the interpreter. "This is terrible. We all pray your leaders will see reason now and end this conflict before more cities suffer the same fate." 3 days later, on August 9th, it happened again. Nagasaki. Another city destroyed. Another weapon that killed tens of thousands in an instant. The Japanese nurses were devastated, moving through their duties like ghosts, barely speaking, processing grief too large for words. But something else was happening among them. Conversations in their section at night took on a different tone. Nurse Tanaka spoke for many when she said quietly, "If our leaders do not surrender now, after this, then they value pride more than lives. How many more cities must be destroyed? How many more must suffer? This must end." Even nurses who had been most resistant to questioning their government found it difficult to argue. What possible justification could there be for continuing? What could be achieved that was worth more Japanese cities being erased from existence? On August 10th, rumors began spreading through the camp. Japan had sent peace overtures, negotiations were happening, the conflict might actually end. American soldiers walked with lighter steps, smiled more easily, dared to hope they might survive after all. 5 days later, on August 15th, the announcement came. Japan had surrendered. The conflict was over. The war had ended. The American camp erupted in celebration. Soldiers shouted, embraced, wept with relief. They had survived. They could go home. Years of fighting, of fear, of watching friends perish, had finally ended. The joy was overwhelming, unbounded. For the Japanese nurses, the moment was more complex. Relief that the destruction had stopped mixed with shame at defeat, grief for all that had been lost, uncertainty about what would happen now. They gathered in their section, holding each other, some crying, some silent, all trying to process the reality that their world had fundamentally changed. Corporal Washington came to their section that evening, accompanied by Kenneth Tanaka. His usual smile was present, but softer, more sympathetic. He spoke, and Tanaka translated. "I know this is difficult for you. I know you feel many things right now, but I want you to know that we are grateful you survived. We are grateful we did not have to invade your homeland, which would have meant terrible suffering for everyone. The fighting is over. Now we can all begin to heal." Keiko found her voice, surprising herself. "What happens to us now?" she asked. "Will we be allowed to return home?" Washington nodded. "Yes. It will take time to arrange transportation and processing, but you will be repatriated to Japan. You will return to your families, to whatever life can be built from what remains. The Americans are already organizing massive relief efforts, food, medicine, supplies to help reconstruction. We do not want to see your people suffer. We want to help rebuild." This statement, coming from a man she had been taught to fear as a monster, was almost too much. Keiko felt tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she managed to say. "Thank you for treating us with kindness when you had no obligation to do so. Thank you for showing us that we were wrong about you." Washington looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, but accepted it with grace. "We were just doing what was right," he said simply, "what anyone should do. I hope you will remember when you return home that people are more than what their governments tell them. Americans are not demons, and I suspect most Japanese people are not demons either. We are all just human beings trying to live our lives." Over the following days, As the reality of peace settled in, the Japanese nurses began to discuss what they would say when they returned home. Some, like Nurse Watanabe, had nothing to return to, their families lost. Others, like young Nurse Sato, wondered if their families would accept them, if they would be seen as tainted by capture and collaboration with the enemy. Keiko thought constantly about what she would tell her father, the retired officer who had been so proud of her service. How could she explain that everything they had believed was propaganda? How could she describe working alongside men they had been taught to despise and discovering they were honorable, decent, kind? Would he believe her? Would he even want to hear it? Nurse Tanaka, pragmatic as always, provided guidance. "We tell the truth," she said firmly. "We tell what we experienced. Some will not believe us. Some will be angry. But we owe it to those who did not survive, to all who suffered, to speak truthfully about what we learned. If this conflict taught us anything, it should be that lies, even well-intentioned lies, lead to suffering. Truth, even uncomfortable truth, is necessary for healing." On September 2nd, the formal surrender documents were signed aboard an American vessel. The war was officially over. The Japanese nurses listened to the news through interpreters, absorbing the finality of it. There would be no reversal, no continuation. It was done. The process of repatriation began in late September. The nurses were organized into groups for transportation back to Japan. Medical screenings were conducted to ensure no one was carrying diseases. They were given new clothing to replace their worn uniforms, provided with basic supplies for the journey home. Before they left, the American medical staff organized a farewell gathering. It was awkward at first, with language barriers and the strange reality of former enemies trying to express mutual respect. But Captain Rodriguez spoke, with Kenneth Tanaka translating, and her words captured what many felt. "You came to us as prisoners," she said. "You leave as colleagues. You worked beside us with dedication and skill. You cared for our wounded as you cared for your own. You showed us that professionalism and humanity transcend nationality. We wish you well in rebuilding your lives and your country. We hope the peace will last, and that future generations will not have to experience what we have experienced." Captain Thompson, the skilled surgeon who had challenged Nurse Tanaka's assumptions, spoke next. "Medicine knows no borders," he said. "Suffering is suffering, regardless of who experiences it. Healing is healing, regardless of who provides it. Take home with you the knowledge that your training and dedication made a difference. Lives were saved because of your work. That matters." Corporal Washington approached Keiko before she boarded the transport vessel. He handed her a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was a medical textbook in English, covering advanced surgical techniques. "I know you cannot read it now," he said through Tanaka, "but perhaps someday you will learn English or find someone to translate. Medicine continues to advance. I thought you might want to continue learning." Keiko accepted the gift with trembling hands, bowing deeply in the Japanese fashion. "I will never forget your kindness," she said. "I will never forget that you and others like you treated us as human beings when you had every reason not to. I will tell this story. I will make sure people know the truth." Washington smiled his gentle smile. "That is all any of us can do. Tell the truth. Build bridges instead of walls. Remember that our common humanity is stronger than our differences. If enough people do that, perhaps future generations will not need to fight such terrible conflicts." The voyage back to Japan took 5 days. The nurses traveled on an American transport vessel, given quarters that were basic but adequate, fed regularly, treated with continued respect by the crew. Some nurses spent the journey in silence, processing everything they had experienced. Others talked constantly, trying to make sense of it all, preparing for the challenges of reintegration into a defeated nation. Keiko stood at the rail on the final evening, watching the sun set over the Pacific, thinking about everything that had changed. 4 months ago, she had believed Americans were demons, had been prepared to take her own life rather than face capture. Now she carried a medical textbook given to her by a man she had been taught was subhuman, a man who had shown her more kindness and respect than some of her own officers. The cognitive dissonance was still painful, but she had learned to live with it. The propaganda had been wrong, comprehensively, deliberately wrong. Accepting that reality meant accepting that she and millions of others had been manipulated, had suffered and sacrificed for a cause built on lies. It was a bitter realization, but also a necessary one. They arrived at Yokohama Harbor on October 7th, 1945. The city was devastated, buildings destroyed, infrastructure damaged, evidence of American air attacks visible everywhere. But there were also signs of rebuilding, of life continuing despite the destruction. People were working, clearing rubble, starting businesses in makeshift buildings, refusing to surrender to despair. The repatriation process took several days. Each nurse was processed individually, questioned about their experiences, examined medically, provided with basic documentation. Keiko's turn came on October 9th. The official conducting her interview was a Japanese civilian administrator working under American Occupation Authority. He asked standard questions about her service, her capture, her time in American custody. She answered honestly, describing the medical facility, the work she had done, the treatment she had received. The administrator's expression was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Finally, he asked the question she had been anticipating with dread. "Did you cooperate with the enemy? Did you provide information or assistance that might have harmed Japan?" Keiko took a deep breath. "I cooperated by continuing to work as a nurse, treating wounded soldiers from both sides. I provided no military information because I had none to provide. I learned that much of what we were taught about Americans was incorrect. I learned that they are human beings with honor and decency, not the monsters we were told they were. I learned that propaganda served only to prolong suffering. If stating these truths counts as cooperation with the enemy, then yes, I cooperated." The administrator looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stamped her papers and handed them to her. "You are cleared for release," he said quietly. "Welcome home, Nurse Yamamoto. I hope you find your family well." Keiko left the processing center and stepped into the streets of Yokohama, breathing the air of Japan for the first time in 9 months. The city was both familiar and alien, changed by conflict and occupation, yet still recognizably home. She had no money for transportation, so she began walking, planning to work her way back to Tokyo and find her family. Along the way, she saw others returning, soldiers and civilians, all trying to navigate this new reality of defeat and occupation. She saw American soldiers directing traffic, distributing food, maintaining order. She saw Japanese civilians interacting with these soldiers, some with hostility, some with wary acceptance, some with surprising friendliness. She thought about what Corporal Washington had said, "Tell the truth, build bridges instead of walls." It seemed so simple, yet so difficult. Many people would not want to hear that the enemy had honor, that the conflict might have been avoided or ended sooner, that sacrifices had been made for reasons that did not withstand scrutiny. But she would tell the truth anyway. Not loudly, not aggressively, but persistently. When people asked about her experiences, she would describe them honestly. When people repeated propaganda about Americans, she would quietly offer alternative perspectives. When people claimed that surrender was shameful, she would point out that survival allowed for rebuilding, for learning, for growth. It took Keiko 3 days to reach Tokyo. The city was even more devastated than Yokohama, vast areas reduced to ash and rubble. But her family's neighborhood, while damaged, had survived. She found her parents' house still standing, and when she knocked on the door, her mother opened it and collapsed in tears, pulling Keiko inside, calling for her father. The reunion was overwhelming. Her parents had believed she was lost, had mourned her, had been preparing to accept that they would never know what happened to her. Now she stood before them, thin and tired but alive. Her father, the retired officer, looked older than she remembered, worn down by defeat and loss. That evening, as they shared a simple meal of rice and vegetables, her father asked what she had experienced. Keiko told him everything. The capture, the fear, the American medical facility, the kindness of soldiers she had been taught to fear. She described Corporal Washington, Captain Thompson, Captain Rodriguez. She described working alongside people of different backgrounds and skin colors, all committed to healing rather than harming. Her father listened without interrupting, his face grave. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "I was taught the same things you were taught," he said quietly. "I believed them. I taught them to others. I sent young people to fight and suffer based on beliefs that were false. I do not know how to reconcile this. I do not know how to live with having been so wrong." Keiko reached across the table and took his hand. "We live with it by accepting the truth and working to ensure future generations are not fed the same lies. We live with it by building something better from what remains. We live with it by remembering that our shared humanity matters more than national pride or ideological purity." Her father's eyes were wet. "You have become wise beyond your years, daughter. I am proud of you, though I grieve for the suffering that brought you this wisdom." In the weeks that followed, Keiko reconnected with other nurses who had been repatriated. Some had found their families, some had not. They gathered occasionally, sharing experiences, supporting each other, trying to navigate the complex emotions of survival and return. Nurse Tanaka had returned to Osaka and was working to reopen the hospital where she had practiced before the conflict. She wrote to Keiko describing the challenges of rebuilding with limited resources, but also the satisfaction of helping people heal. Young Nurse Sato had found her family alive and was living quietly in the countryside, helping her parents with their farm. Nurse Watanabe, who had lost everyone, had joined a Buddhist monastery and was seeking peace through contemplation and service. Keiko began working at a makeshift clinic established by American occupation forces to provide medical care to Japanese civilians. It was strange at first, working under American authority in her own country, but the work was needed, and she had skills to offer. The American medical personnel recognized her training and welcomed her assistance. She encountered prejudice from some Japanese civilians who saw her work with Americans as collaboration or betrayal. She endured their comments with patience, understanding that their anger came from suffering and loss, not from genuine assessment of her actions. She continued her work, treating patients regardless of their opinions of her choices. Months passed. Winter came, bringing cold that was especially harsh for people without adequate shelter or heating. Keiko worked long hours at the clinic, treating malnutrition, pneumonia, injuries from reconstruction accidents, the countless ailments of a population recovering from total conflict. The American medical staff worked alongside Japanese personnel with remarkable cooperation, focused on meeting overwhelming need rather than dwelling on recent enmity. One day in February of 1946, Keiko was treating a patient when a familiar voice spoke her name. She turned to see Kenneth Tanaka, the interpreter who had facilitated so many conversations during her captivity. He was still working with occupation forces, translating, helping bridge cultural gaps, facilitating reconstruction efforts. "Nurse Yamamoto," he said with genuine warmth, "I'm glad to see you are continuing your profession. The Americans speak highly of your work." They talked for several minutes, catching up on the months since repatriation. Tanaka mentioned that some of the American medical personnel from Okinawa were now stationed in Japan, participating in occupation and reconstruction. Corporal Washington was among them, working at a field hospital in Yokohama. Keiko felt a surge of emotion at the news. She asked Tanaka if it would be appropriate to visit, to thank Washington again for his kindness. Tanaka smiled. "I think he would be pleased to see you. The Americans value such connections. They want to build friendship with the Japanese people, to transform former enemies into allies." A week later, Keiko traveled to Yokohama and found the field hospital where Washington was stationed. He was surprised and genuinely happy to see her, greeting her with his characteristic gentle smile. They talked for an hour with Tanaka translating, discussing their work, the challenges of reconstruction, the slow process of healing on both personal and national levels. Washington asked if she had been able to use the medical textbook he had given her. Keiko admitted she had not yet learned enough English to read it, but was studying the language slowly. Washington offered to arrange English lessons through the occupation education programs being established. Education was key to rebuilding, he said, and medical professionals who could communicate internationally would be valuable in the new Japan that was emerging. Before she left, Keiko asked Washington a question that had troubled her for months. "How do you not hate us?" she asked. "How do you show such kindness to people whose country fought yours, who would have ended you if they could? How do you move past that?" Washington considered the question carefully. "Hate serves no purpose now," he said finally. "The fighting is over. Continuing to hate would only prevent healing. Your leaders made decisions that led to conflict. American leaders made decisions too. But you and I, we are not our leaders. We are individuals with choices. So I choose to focus on what can be built, rather than what was destroyed. I choose to see the person before me, not just the nationality. I choose hope over bitterness." He paused, then added, "Also, I saw during the conflict that Japanese soldiers and nurses were human beings, with families and dreams and fears like anyone else. Once you truly see the humanity in others, it becomes very difficult to hate them. Even when circumstances make you enemies, that fundamental humanity remains." Keiko bowed deeply, in the Japanese fashion, holding the bow longer than usual to convey profound respect. "You have taught me more than medical techniques," she said. "You have taught me about human dignity, about choosing compassion over hatred, about building instead of destroying. I will carry these lessons for the rest of my life." Years passed. Japan rebuilt, slowly but steadily, transforming from defeated empire to peaceful democracy. The American occupation ended in 1952, and the two nations established diplomatic relations, former enemies becoming allies. The transformation was remarkable, unprecedented in history. Keiko continued her medical career, eventually becoming director of a hospital in Tokyo. She trained new nurses, always emphasizing not just technical skills, but the importance of seeing patients as human beings first, everything else second. She told her students about her experiences during the conflict, about being captured by an enemy she had been taught to fear, about discovering that kindness and professionalism transcended nationality. Some students found her stories difficult to believe, especially younger ones who had not experienced the conflict directly. "How could you have believed such things about Americans?" they would ask. "How could anyone think that way?" Keiko would explain patiently about propaganda, about how fear and ignorance could be weaponized, about how lies repeated often enough could become accepted as truth. She would emphasize that vigilance against such manipulation was a lifelong responsibility, that every generation must guard against those who would divide humanity into us and them for political purposes. In 1965, 20 years after the conflict ended, Keiko attended an international medical conference in Hawaii. It was her first time traveling outside Japan since her repatriation. The conference brought together medical professionals from around the world, including many Americans. On the second day, someone called her name. She turned to see a man in his 50s, gray-haired but still recognizable despite 2 decades of aging. Corporal Washington, now Dr. Washington, having completed his medical education after the conflict on the American government's Veteran Benefits Program. He was practicing internal medicine in Chicago, teaching at a medical school, training the next generation of physicians. They embraced like old friends, tears in both their eyes, years of distance collapsing in an instant. They spent hours catching up, sharing photographs of families, discussing careers, marveling at how much had changed since those difficult days on Okinawa. Washington had married, had 3 children, was living the peaceful life he had hoped for during the conflict. Keiko had also married, to a doctor she met during reconstruction efforts, and had 2 daughters. They talked about the impact those months had on their lives. Washington admitted that his experiences treating Japanese prisoners had shaped his approach to medicine, reinforcing his belief that healing required seeing past superficial differences to the shared humanity beneath. Keiko described how her captivity had shattered her worldview and rebuilt it on stronger foundations, teaching her to question authority, value truth, prioritize compassion. Before they parted, Washington said something that stayed with Keiko for the rest of her life. "You know what the greatest victory was?" he asked. "Not the military victory, not even the peace treaty. The greatest victory was that you and I, who were supposed to be enemies, who were taught to hate and fear each other, became friends. That we proved that our governments and their propaganda were wrong about what mattered most. That we chose connection over division. That small victory, multiplied across millions of individual relationships, is what truly transformed Japan and America from enemies into allies. Keiko nodded, understanding completely. And that is why we must tell these stories. Why we must ensure that future generations understand that the path to peace begins with recognizing the humanity in those we are told to fear. The propaganda that led to conflict is still out there, still being used, still dividing people. Our responsibility is to counter it with truth, with our own stories of discovering that enemies can become friends. That fear can be replaced with understanding, that healing is always possible if we choose it. They maintained contact after that conference, exchanging letters, occasionally meeting at international medical gatherings, watching with satisfaction as Japan and America's friendship deepened over the decades. They both lived long lives, Washington passing in 1998 at age 75, Keiko in 2006 at age 84. Before she died, Keiko recorded extensive oral history interviews documenting her experiences during the conflict and its aftermath. She wanted future generations to understand what propaganda could do, how it could twist perception, how it could make people believe terrible things about others who were fundamentally no different from themselves. But she also wanted them to understand that such indoctrination could be overcome, that direct human contact could shatter even the most deeply held prejudices, that choosing compassion over hatred was always possible. Her interviews are now preserved in multiple archives, used in schools and universities to teach about the conflict, about propaganda, about reconciliation. Students watch her speak, this elderly woman with kind eyes and gentle voice, describing the fear she felt when captured, the shock of discovering her captors were not monsters, the gradual transformation as she worked alongside people she had been programmed to despise. The lesson she most wanted people to understand was simple yet profound. We are all vulnerable to manipulation. We can all be taught to fear and hate those who are different from us, but we can also choose in every moment to seek truth, to value human connection, to build bridges instead of walls. The conflict between Japan and America ended not just because one side surrendered, but because people on both sides chose to see each other as human beings worthy of respect and compassion. That choice is available to every generation, in every conflict, between every group that has been taught to hate. The question is whether we are brave enough to make it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.